Organizations' IT landscape has been evolving at a far greater speed than it probably did in the last 5 years. There is an explosion of data on the edge. There is a constant thrust to adopt innovative products and services, and hence there is a greater need to adopt multi-cloud as an organizational strategy for many organizations today. But the big question is, how does an organization really manage these distributed IT assets? Probably Microsoft Hybrid Cloud has the answer to this. So in this episode, let's look at what are the various Microsoft Hybrid Cloud products and services that can help organizations who are adopting a multi-cloud strategy or even processing these data in the edge. Hello and welcome back, and thanks again for tuning into Giant on Cloud. My name is Giant. I work as a Senior Principal Engineering Technologist at Dell Technologies. And please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to get notified as and when I upload new videos. So in this episode, we're going to look at what is Azure Arc and how Azure Arc can help organizations simplify the complexity around managing the distributed IT assets. So without wasting much time, let's dig right in. So to enable digital transformation today, many organizations are modernizing their data centers. They're trying to build new applications in the cloud, leveraging the AI ML capabilities. So as a result, the IT environments are continuously being evolved with different types of applications. Sometimes they're running on different types of hardware across a distributed locations, including it could be on-premises, it could be multi-cloud, or it could be the edge. So, which is kind of creating a whole new set of challenges for IT in general. So, for instance, how do you seamlessly govern and secure IT resources regardless of where they're running? Or how do they bring the cloud innovation to existing infrastructure? Or for instance, how do you modernize local data centers with new cloud infrastructure? Now the answers to these questions are very, very strategic to the business. So for IT as an organization, right, it's no longer just about monitoring and troubleshooting, but it's more towards activities that are that can add business value, such as, for instance, developing new applications or analytics capabilities that actually help accelerate business decisions, which is very, very key today. So this is what is really driving IT to modernize and ensure all these companies cannot just survive but really thrive in the new virtual world. So let's look at some facts and figures. Now, according to IDC, about 92% of the organizations have both public and private cloud environments. About 82% are already working with 3 or more cloud solution providers. And only about 50% of all of the applications are expected to stay in single place, which means you're going to have distributed applications all around. So which tells us multi-cloud is the new norm, and many organizations today are adopting multi-cloud as a new organizational initiative. Alright, so let's look at why organizations today are increasingly adopting multi-cloud as a strategy. The first option that comes to my mind is workload optimization. Now, the biggest benefit of multi-cloud strategy is that it allows companies today to select the cloud solution provider of their choice and the workload benefits that they get out of that cloud solution provider. For example, one cloud vendor's service might be less expensive than a similar service that's available elsewhere, or a particular service might have more features than the same comparable service elsewhere. Or some cloud solution providers may offer IaaS instances that are configured probably different than others, and that suits in the respective organizations. Say for example, one cloud solution provider may include slightly more memory for the same SKU of IaaS service that's offered in a different cloud solution provider. So these are some of the optimizations which organizations are looking at to make the best use of their buck. The other option is the flexibility. Remember, these workload optimization decisions aren't going to be like one-time choices. So the businesses, there is a greater need for these businesses to keep changing this all the time. So the services that was probably right for them at a particular workload, probably at one point of time, may not be of relevance maybe tomorrow. In addition, these cloud solution providers services also keep changing all the time. Now the vendors keep on adding new features, new services on a regular basis. So they may also bring, for instance, new data center online that is probably more geographically beneficial to these organizations who are actually who are looking at workload optimizations. So these are some of the flexibility that multi-cloud also brings. The public cloud computing costs are huge concerns for many enterprises today, particularly for those that have been using public cloud for quite some time. In fact, RightScale did some research on trying to kind of evaluate some of the top challenges for enterprises adopting public cloud. And it turns out that cost was one of the top challenges which most of these enterprises had while they were actually adopting public cloud. So the big part of the problem is that cloud pricing is incredibly complex. Now users need to kind of select from a mind-boggling array of instances types that are available from a cloud solution provider, right? And different data center locations offer different prices, different services offer different prices, and some cloud solution providers offer very competitive pricing in terms of discounts and so on. So this is where a multi-cloud strategy will help organizations to keep these kind of costs under control by allowing them to use the particular vendor which offers best performance for a price point. So the other option to look at is the reliability. Now, another key aspect of multi-cloud benefit is the reliability, definitely. So the reason why reliability is one of the key tenets of multi-cloud is many enterprises use multi-cloud as part of their disaster recovery business continuity planning, right? So, and in that case, it makes a lot of sense to use at least two different clouds to achieve continuous BCDR, like business continuity disaster recovery, for which is of greater value for these organizations. Now, another benefit of multi-cloud is that organizations today can put workloads in whichever cloud service and whichever data center best meets their security and compliance needs. Now, the vendor lock-in avoidance. Now, enterprises say that one of the key multi-cloud benefits that they are trying to achieve by pursuing a multi-cloud strategy is to avoid that vendor lock-in. By using a single public cloud vendor puts any organizations more or less at the mercy of that vendor, potentially driving up the prices. So this is where organizations feel that yes, if I adopt a multi-cloud, multi-vendor as a to avoid vendor lock-in, that helps organizations to optimize costs. So employee satisfaction. So while this is, I know this is something that I didn't even think about, but when I was actually reading up, that's when I saw this particular reason for organizations adopting multi-cloud. While this potential multi-cloud benefit isn't often discussed, to be very honest, but some employees where organizations are going to hire clearly prefer one particular cloud solution provider over the other. So this has been driving a lot of organizations to look at. Also, one of the reasons why organizations are trying to adopt it. Alright, so we looked at some of the reasons for adopting multi-cloud. Now let's look at some of the challenges with multi-cloud. Complexity. The most obvious drawback to a multi-cloud environment is that it's very complicated to monitor and manage. And enterprises are more likely to find that all the free tools provided by the cloud vendors are no longer adequate to manage the multi-cloud environment. So they may need to reinvest in the new tooling and possibly even increase the headcount in order to kind of compensate this. So the other thing is the increased management costs. Now, when you talk about complexity, obviously there are new tools and new employees. They all come with a price tag, and if enterprises aren't careful, they may find that the savings that they're actually planning to achieve by adopting multi-cloud may end up actually spending even more. So this is something that organizations need to be really apprehensive about. Security aspect of it. Now, using more cloud companies also means that you're inviting more hackers and potential access points into your network, right? So it's very important to understand what security measures that your respective cloud solution providers have taken in place, so that you have the appropriate tools to protect your entire network. Okay? So it could be public cloud, private cloud, or anything. So talent scarcity is another important aspect to consider. Many employers today, organizations report that it's very, very difficult to find an IT staff with with multi-cloud computing expertise. Even if when you are looking for someone who knows one vendor's product, if you're looking for someone who understands multiple public clouds, hiring becomes that much more difficult, and potentially it's going to be very, very expensive as well. So these are some of the challenges that organizations face today adopting multi-cloud. Alright, so that brings us to what is Azure Arc. So what exactly is Azure Arc and how does it really work? Now, Azure Arc is nothing but it's a set of technologies that basically are designed to unlock the new hybrid scenarios like we talked about in the previous slides as well, for customers by extending the Azure services and management capabilities to any infrastructure. Now, so that customers today can actually go and build, operate, manage pretty much all of their resources for traditional cloud native and distributed edge applications in a consistent way across the entire IT ecosystem. So that's the intent really of Azure Arc. So this means that now organizations can manage and operate all of their existing and IT resources consistently. That is a key here. Consistently at scale and wherever they reside, right from an Azure control plane. Right? So we talked about multi-cloud, we talked about edge computing. So these are distributed IT assets. Now the challenge, we also talked about some of the challenges that come with it. Right? Now if Microsoft is able to provide us a tooling where you're able to consistently manage all of these distributed resources right from an Azure control plane, that has to be through Azure Arc. Now there are basically two pillars to Azure Arc. One is the Azure Arc enabled infrastructure, which basically helps organizations to connect their resources, which potentially lives outside of Azure today. Like we talked about, there are some compute instances which could be in edge locations or in a different cloud solution provider, and operate them as if they were actually native Azure resources, right? And using the same management tools and services that today Azure provides. In fact, we're going to look at it. So I'm going to have a detailed discussion on various Azure Arc services. For example, Azure Arc for servers, Azure Arc for Kubernetes, Azure Arc for that's called containers, and so there are Azure Arc for data services and application services and so on and so forth. So we will have a detailed demo-driven episodes on each of these services. But for now, we're going to look at the two major pillars of Azure Arc. The second one is basically the Azure Arc enabled services. So with Azure Arc enabled services, you as an organization basically have the flexibility to deploy a fully managed Azure service anywhere. So it could be on premises or in other public clouds like we talked about. So you can literally take advantage of some of the cloud benefits literally everywhere, such as something like scalability or being able to achieve faster deployment or life cycle, and always up to date with cloud innovation. So these are some of the key things. So what is really great is that you can actually initiate and manage this deployment right from an Azure. This is magical. So when we actually walk through some of the things, I will probably touch upon how Azure Arc is so powerful. It literally is the glue that is used to stitch the IT resources that are living outside of Azure. Alright, so now let's get cracking with some live demos. So as you can see now, I've logged into portal.azure.com. So now if you just search Azure Arc, Azure Arc is actually one of the services there. So if I click on Azure Arc, so it basically brings up the Azure Arc homepage, the Azure portal. Now I have different options to look here. So just to get started, basically tells you an overview of what Azure Arc is all about. And there are infrastructures and services. So let's go to infrastructure one by one. So just keep in mind that I'm going to go through each of these services that I'm going to discuss right now in a very detailed episode for each one of them by doing a live demonstration. For now, we're just going to walk through what are the various Arc services that are there. So now the first one that you have is Azure Arc service. So think about virtual machines, or think about any physical hardware. For example, it could be an operating system deployed on a bare metal server. So all of that service can be actually surfaced into Azure Control Plane. So maybe I can just quickly show you what I've done. So basically, if you see, there are a couple of instances that says one of the instances that says it's GCP-Ubuntu. In fact, this is an Ubuntu server that's actually deployed in a Google Cloud environment, right? So there is one more resource that says JY Azure Stack HCI CLU W2K19. It's an operating system that I've actually deployed. It's a VM instance that I've deployed on one of the HCI clusters running on premises, right? So both of these VMs have actually surfaced into Azure. So like I said, we will have a deeper demo going into each of these things. Is how you actually surface or you discover these servers into Azure Arc. Okay, so now going into infrastructure. So the other option that you have is Kubernetes clusters. For example, any CNCF compliant Kubernetes clusters can be onboarded using Azure Arc, right? It could be EKS, or it could be GKE, or it could be VMware, Tanzu and VMware. So any of these container distributions can be, as long as they're CNCF compliant, can be surfaced into Azure Arc. SQL Server, for example, you can even discover a SQL Server that's just potentially running a SQL Server availability group, for instance, can be discovered, and you can tie an Azure construct, right? So now if I just click on what do you mean by tying an Azure construct, so let me just click on, for example, this virtual machine, which is an Ubuntu virtual machine, which is running in Google Cloud. So as you can see on the left hand side, right, I can tie any Azure construct. For example, I can do tagging, I can do logs, I can do Azure security, or I can do access control management. to bring in that additional security posture to the overall IT ecosystem that I want to, right? And Azure policies, think about, for instance, right? I have distributed, virtual machines which are deployed, some in Google Cloud and some in AWS and some on premises. Let's say if I have to really, manage policies consistently as an organizational initiative. For example, I want to enforce a strict password policy on all the virtual machines. How do I do it? Right? If I have to really do it, I have to use the independent consoles and the management tooling that is available with the respective cloud solution providers to achieve that. Instead, if I could do all of that from an Azure control plane, that is truly magical. This is how customers, it will truly benefit customers who are trying to manage this system. Alright, so going back to Azure Arc again, and going back to infrastructure. So Azure Arc virtual machines, this is something right now in public preview. So which means it will basically provide you the ability to even self-provision a virtual machine anywhere on your infrastructure, right? Typically, right now this is has to be deployed against a Kubernetes platform as a target. But think about it something like your ability to go spin up or self-service a virtual machine onto infrastructure that resides outside of Azure. Alright, so other platforms that are going to be supported, and it's right now all of them is in public preview, is VMware vSphere and System Center Virtual Machine Manager. So all of this is in private preview today. If you have those instances running, you can surface them up into Azure using Azure Arc. Now, Azure Stack HCI is something that we saw already, right? Azure Stack HCI is one of the Azure Arc resources. So which means when you register an Azure Stack HCI cluster, it gets registered against Azure subscription and all the nodes show up under the Azure Stack HCI service. Alright, so now moving on to services. If you look at some of the services that are available. So we talked about surfacing the IT landscape that resides outside of Azure. So you can actually glue them together using Azure Arc and manage them right from Azure. Okay? And what if you want to deploy the Azure native services onto these infrastructures? So that is also possible. That's the other pillar that we talked about. The Azure Arc services, right? So basically, I can deploy a simple managed instance, just like I would deploy a simple managed instance in public Azure, right? So it's an evergreen SQL. The best part is it's a SQL server that resides on your premises, right? And it's just like Azure SQL managed instance, right? And all your routine DBA tasks can be minimized dramatically using SQL MI. And not just that, right? It also saves you a little bit of cost because you're running this not on Azure infrastructure, whereas you're running this on your own infrastructure premises, but it runs just like an Azure SQL. So PostgreSQL Hyperscale right now it's in actually public preview. So once it's generally available, so it's going to be there. You can deploy PostgreSQL Hyperscale. Like I said, so all of this should be enabled for your Azure subscription. You can try it out yourself. And the other options is some of the application services. For example, the Azure Arc service, the ability to go deploy, web applications, right? Using either .NET framework or Java framework, or whatever that you're comfortable with, right? So you can go do that right from an Azure portal. Whereas this actually is targeted onto IT infrastructure sites outside. So logic apps or serverless computing using Azure Functions, API. So all of this right now is in public preview, right? So these, as we can see, right, these are some of the really potentially strengths of Azure Arc, where it helps you not only to manage and monitor and govern your resources, which are actually residing outside of Azure, right from an Azure control plane, but it also helps you to seamlessly deploy these services. For example, the Azure Arc-enabled data services, for instance, or app services, for instance. All of that right from Azure Control Plane to the infrastructure that is residing in it. So this is truly the magic of Azure Arc, and no wonder it's getting so much of popularity with enterprises and customers. Alright, so with that, I've come to the end of this episode. So just to recap, in this episode, we discussed what are some of the reasons why organizations today are hopping on to multi-cloud, and what are some of the challenges going with multi-cloud. And we also saw what is Azure Arc and how Azure Arc can actually solve some of the multi-cloud challenges or distributed IT landscape of organizations can be solved using Azure Arc, using basically two different pillars that we talked about. One pillar, the ability to project the IT resources that are living outside of Azure into Azure Control Plane, and some of the native Azure services that can be deployed into IT infrastructure that is living outside of Azure. So in my next episode, we're going to talk about each of these Azure services in detail. So if you like this episode, please click on the like button, and if you have any feedbacks, please put them under your feedbacks and comments, and let me know what you think about this episode. Thank you so much.